He came in wearing faded khaki and worn sneakers, his daughter's hand in his and nothing else worth noticing, or so the salesman decided. Carter read him in 4 seconds flat. The conclusion was immediate, and 2 minutes later, Elijah Ward was being guided, with practiced politeness, back out through the front door of the most exclusive showroom in the city. His daughter held her rabbit and said nothing. He did not argue. He did not explain. He walked to his car. He did not know the CEO had been watching from the second floor, and she had just recognized what he was driving. What Giselle saw in that parking lot was not just a car, it was a secret worth $4 million. The morning had begun the way most mornings did in Elijah Ward's household, with the smell of butter in a small pan and the sound of a 6-year-old narrating her own thoughts to a stuffed rabbit. Bonnie sat at the kitchen table with Clover propped against the orange juice glass, explaining in great detail why pancakes shaped like stars were superior to pancakes shaped like circles, while Elijah stood at the stove and flipped them without comment. The kitchen was clean and unhurried. A few of Bonnie's drawings were fixed to the refrigerator with magnets, a house with a very large sun, a rabbit the size of the house, a figure labeled Dad with enormous hands. There was nothing else on the walls. No awards, no framed degrees, no photographs that might suggest who this man had once been or what he had once built with those large, rough-knuckled hands. Elijah Ward was 38 years old, and he had arranged his life with great care to resemble exactly what it appeared to be, an ordinary one. He was not, by any reasonable definition of the word, ordinary, but he had chosen simplicity, the way some men choose exile deliberately, quietly, and with full knowledge of what they were leaving behind. 4 years earlier, he had signed over his remaining stake in Hollow Ridge Automotive to a board of investors and walked out of the building on a gray November afternoon without saying goodbye to anyone except Owen Caldwell, his co-founder, and the only person who had known him before the company, had a name. Hollow Ridge had been Elijah's life for 11 years, a precision engineering firm that started in a leased warehouse outside of Denver and grew into one of the most respected manufacturers of performance vehicle prototypes in NISSA's North America. He had built the first chassis by hand. He had designed the suspension geometry on graph paper at a kitchen table, not unlike this one. He had poured himself into that work with the particular obsession of someone who does not yet understand that some obsessions have consequences. The consequence arrived on a Wednesday in March, on a stretch of closed test track in the high desert, when a calibration error in a braking system that Elijah himself had signed off on sent a car into a concrete barrier at 112 miles per hour. His wife, Rachel, had been in the passenger seat. She was conducting acoustic testing. She was not supposed to have been there that day. She had switched shifts with a technician who had a sick child at home. The technician survived. Rachel did not. Elijah drove home that night, sat in the garage with the door closed, and stayed there until Bonnie cried from her crib at 2 in the morning. He got up. He made a bottle. He never went back to Hollow Ridge. He sold everything. He kept one thing. The truck that had served as the family's daily vehicle for the past 3 years had finally given up its transmission on a Friday afternoon, dying with a series of grinding protests in the parking lot of Bonnie's school. Elijah had called a tow, borrowed a neighbor's sedan for the weekend, and spent Saturday evening on his phone looking at options. Owen had mentioned Meridian Auto Group during a call earlier that week. They had a location 20 minutes from the house, good inventory, professional staff. Nothing dramatic, just a place to buy a sensible 7-seater. Elijah closed the phone, stood up, and walked to the garage door. He put his hand on the metal handle and stopped. Behind that door, beneath a fitted canvas cover, sat a machine that had no business being parked in a rented house in a quiet suburb. He did not pull the cover back. He had not done so in 4 months. He went to bed instead, and in the morning he told Bonnie they were going to look at a new car, and she brought Clover without being asked, because she brought Clover everywhere, and they drove to Meridian in the borrowed sedan, and Elijah did not think about the garage. The Meridian Auto Group showroom on Clearwater Boulevard was the kind of space that had been designed to make ordinary people feel slightly inadequate, which was, of course, precisely the point. The floor was pale stone that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. The ceiling was tall and bright and curated with recessed lighting that fell on the vehicles like stage light on sculpture. There were 11 cars on the floor that morning, each one on its own island of illumination, each one angled with the geometry of seduction. The staff wore navy blazers with silver pins. They moved through the room in that particular way of salespeople trained to appear casual while remaining categorically alert. Carter Blaine had been the floor's senior sales director for 6 years, and he was very good at his job, by which it should be understood that he was very good at identifying who would buy something and who would not, a skill he considered both a professional virtue and a personal gift. He spotted Elijah Ward the moment he came through the front door. A khaki shirt, slightly wrinkled at the collar. Dark jeans with a faint stain at the knee, the kind left by damp concrete. White sneakers, once white, now the color of old paper. A small girl in a yellow dress holding a stuffed rabbit. Carter's eyes moved once, top to bottom, and the calculation completed itself in under 3 seconds. He stepped forward anyway. It cost nothing to be polite to someone who would leave empty-handed. He offered his hand, offered a smile, and asked in a warm, professional voice what had brought them in today. Elijah shook his hand and said he was looking for a 7-seat SUV, something safe and practical, cash purchase, flexible on model. Carter processed the phrase cash purchase without expression. People said cash purchase sometimes when they meant financing, and the ones who actually meant it did not typically show up in borrowed clothes with dried concrete on their knees. He nodded and said that was wonderful, and that there were several excellent options he'd love to show them. And then he guided them not to the Traverse section, but to the auxiliary display near the rear of the floor, where the entry-level models sat without much ceremony. He spent 5 minutes on a mid-tier model, pointing out the cargo capacity and the entertainment screens, with the enthusiasm of someone who has explained the same features 300 times. The model in question had a starting price of $54,000 and was, in Carter's expert estimation, exactly what this particular customer needed, meaning it was the most expensive thing Carter thought this man could plausibly afford, without embarrassing either of them. He talked about the panoramic sunroof and the 3-zone climate control, with a warmth that was entirely manufactured and still perfectly convincing, because Carter was skilled at that particular kind of warmth, the kind that gestures at sincerity without ever quite touching it. Elijah listened without interrupting, his hands in his pockets, his weight balanced on both feet in the unhurried way of someone who has nowhere else to be and no particular reason to perform impatience. Carter took this for passivity. He was wrong, but he would not understand that for another half hour. When Carter finished, Elijah asked in a conversational tone about the adaptive torque distribution on the Traverse 4.0 and whether the rear differential was open or limited slip in sport mode. Carter blinked. The question was precise, not the kind of question a person asked after looking something up online, but the kind asked by someone who already understood the answer and was testing the source. It was a question you asked when you wanted to know whether the person across from you actually knew what they were selling. Carter recovered quickly. He said that was a great question, and that the technical specifications were available in the brochure, and that he could also connect Elijah with their product specialist if he wanted to get into the details. The offer was smooth and entirely evasive, which was exactly what it was designed to be. Elijah accepted the brochure. He looked at the cover photograph. He did not open it. Bonnie, meanwhile, had been very quiet, which in Bonnie's case meant she was paying the fullest possible attention. She pointed at a silver vehicle near the entrance and asked her father whether it was prettier than the car in their garage. Carter heard that. He smiled at the girl and asked, in the practiced gentle voice he used on children and elderly customers, what kind of car Daddy kept in the garage. Bonnie said it was gray and very low, and that it didn't have any words written on it anywhere. Carter looked at Elijah with the expression of someone whose suspicion has just been pleasantly confirmed. Old project car, most likely. Something a hands-on man assembled on weekends from second-hand parts and internet forums. He nodded, as if the information had settled something that needed settling. 20 minutes later, Elijah asked to test drive the Traverse 4.0. The car was priced at $118,000. Carter said he would check on availability. He stepped away, made a phone call that was not about availability, and returned to say the test vehicles were unfortunately committed for the morning. Elijah looked through the glass door at the lot behind the building, where 3 Traverse models sat in a row with no visible appointments on their windshields. He pointed this out without changing his tone. Carter said those particular units had prior commitments that didn't show up in the system yet. He said it smoothly and without hesitation, because he had said similar things before. At that moment, a couple came through the front door on the other side of the showroom, the man in a charcoal suit, the woman in a cream blazer, both carrying the particular ease of people who expected to be greeted immediately. Carter excused himself. He did not excuse himself from Elijah the way you excuse yourself from a valued customer. He excused himself the way you set down something you've been holding while you wait for something better to arrive. He was across the room in seconds, smiling differently, shaking hands differently, already pulling keys for the Traverse before anyone had asked. Elijah watched. Bonnie watched her father watching. She had seen that expression before in the car after certain school pickups, in the pharmacy once when a man at the counter had spoken to Elijah as though he were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be addressed. She pressed Clover against her chest and said nothing because she understood, in the wordless way that young children sometimes understand the emotional geometry of a room, that her father was making a decision about how to respond, and that she should wait for him to finish making it. Carter returned a few minutes later, with a card in his hand, a colleague's card, someone else's number, the card of a person who was not present and had not agreed to be offered as an alternative. He said something about following up, about scheduling a proper appointment, about the morning being particularly hectic and timing being everything. Then he dropped his voice. Not far enough. He suggested that Avenue Motors across the road had a very solid selection of certified pre-owned vehicles, that their financing was more accessible, that their process was, in his words, a bit more flexible for various situations. He said various situations the way people say it when they mean one specific situation and don't want to be accused of saying it plainly. A woman at the adjacent display stopped looking at the center console of the vehicle she'd been examining and looked instead at Carter. A young couple near the entrance exchanged a glance. Elijah heard every word. He recognized the specific architecture of that kind of sentence, the polite surface, and the unmistakable meaning underneath, the way it was designed to accomplish a dismissal while maintaining the technical appearance of helpfulness. He stood very still for a moment, the way he sometimes stood at the kitchen counter at night after Bonnie was in bed, processing something he had decided not to carry into the next room. Then he bent down to Bonnie's level and said, quietly, that they were going to head out now. She asked whether the man had been unkind to him. Elijah straightened. He looked at Carter once not with anger, not with the heat of someone preparing to fight with the flat, level expression of someone who has made a clear-eyed decision that this particular moment is not worth the cost of becoming the version of himself he no longer chooses to be. He told Bonnie that the man had simply looked at the wrong thing. They walked toward the door. Carter, behind them, said something low and brief and intended to be private that was not quite private enough. Elijah heard the relevant part. He did not stop walking. He pushed through the glass door, and the morning air came at him cool and unremarkable, and Bonnie's hand was small and steady in his, and he told himself it did not matter, and he was nearly convincing. Upstairs, at the northeast corner of the building's second floor, Giselle Navarro stood at the window of her temporary office with a cup of coffee she had not touched since it was handed to her 40 minutes ago. She had driven up from the central office that morning without announcement, a habit she had maintained since taking over as Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Auto Group 3 years earlier. Announced visits produced performances. Unannounced visits produced truth. She had been reviewing quarterly margin reports when Diana, her executive assistant, paused at the window and said something low and even. There was a man downstairs who had just been walked to the door. Giselle did not look up immediately. There were, in her experience, many men walked to many doors in many dealerships, and few of those situations required her direct attention. Then Diana said that the man's car was parked in the visitor lot to the left. Giselle looked up. She set down the report. She walked to the window. The car sat at the far end of the first row. Low, very low. The kind of ground clearance that suggested serious aerodynamic intent, not aesthetic. The body was painted in a matte gray, so dark it appeared almost charcoal in the morning light, with no reflective sheen and no badge of any kind on the rear or the hood. To a person who did not know, it looked like an expensive hobby project, the kind of thing a skilled amateur might have assembled over years from parts and ambition. But Giselle Navarro was not a person who did not know. She had spent 20 years in the automotive sector, the last decade of it at the executive level, and she had developed, through long professional exposure and genuine personal interest, an eye for vehicle design that went well beyond surface aesthetics. She recognized the rear quarter panel arc at once, a specific 11.7-degree curve at the lower trailing edge of the body that existed in exactly one production vehicle on the planet, the Hollow Ridge Series 1 prototype. Internal designation, HRS1. Built as a single unit in late 2019, debuted privately in 2020, and sold at a closed auction in Geneva in 2021 for $4.2 million to a buyer registered through an anonymous trust in Delaware. Giselle's acquisitions team had tried twice to contact that trust. Neither attempt had received a reply. The car had not appeared at any public venue, in any private collection inventory, or in any enthusiast publication since the sale. It had, to all visible purposes, ceased to exist. And yet here it was, parked in the visitor lot of her mid-range suburban dealership on a Tuesday morning, while its owner walked a 6-year-old girl toward the driver's door with a calm that looked, from this distance, like the calm of a man who had not come here to be noticed. Giselle set her coffee cup on the windowsill. She turned to Diana and told her to go downstairs and ask that man to wait. Diana was already moving before the sentence finished. Giselle picked up her phone, opened a search, typed 3 words, and found in under 30 seconds what she had already suspected. Elijah Ward, age 38, co-founder and former chief engineer of Hollow Ridge Automotive. Sold his stake in 2021 under undisclosed terms. No public statements, no interviews, no subsequent professional profile of any kind. A man who had built something remarkable and then, by all appearances, simply walked away from it and from everything connected to it, except the car. He had kept the car. Giselle put her phone face down on the desk, took her blazer from the back of the chair, and walked downstairs without Diana, without an agenda, and without the particular executive composure she normally treated as a professional uniform. Diana reached Elijah just as he was lowering Bonnie into the passenger seat of a modest borrowed sedan. She said the CEO of the company would like to speak with him if he had a moment. Elijah looked at her. There was no surprise in his face, no flash of satisfaction, no calculation running behind his eyes. He looked at the building for a moment, then back at Diana, and said with genuine disinterest that it wasn't necessary. Diana told him that the CEO had recognized his car. A pause followed, longer than courtesy required. Elijah looked down at the front of the borrowed sedan, then back at the building, and said, with a small and entirely unreadable expression, "Is that right?" He leaned back into the passenger window and told Bonnie he had a quick thing to take care of and asked if she could wait with the nice lady for a few minutes. Bonnie studied Diana with the unblinking assessment of a child who has not yet learned that staring is impolite, decided she was acceptable, and told her father she would allow it. Elijah stood up. He straightened his shirt once, and he walked back through the front door of the Meridian showroom, looking exactly the same as when he had walked out of it, except for something subtle and private in his posture that had not been there 10 minutes before. Giselle met him in the atrium before the elevator, which meant she had come down specifically rather than waiting for him to come up, and that was not a small thing in the unspoken language of people who deal in hierarchies for a living. She was 41 years old, in a dark blazer over a white shirt, her black hair pulled back with the efficiency of someone who considers grooming a form of discipline rather than vanity. She looked at him the way she looked at acquisitions, not warmly, but without false distance either. Directly, with the specific attention of someone who intends to form an accurate opinion. She said, "You own the HRS1, not a question." Elijah said, "Yes." A short silence settled between them, comfortable on his side and slightly less so on hers, because Giselle Navarro was not accustomed to silences that she had not strategically placed. She said her acquisitions team had attempted to contact the holding trust twice over the past 2 years. He said he knew. She said there had been no response. He said that was correct. She waited. He did not elaborate. She looked at him for another moment, and then said, with the directness she considered both a virtue and occasionally an inconvenience, "Why are you here, in this dealership, today?" He told her he needed a reliable 7-seat vehicle for his daughter. She said that was not what she meant. He said he knew that too. She brought him upstairs, to the private reception room rather than her office, because the office was hers and the reception room belonged to neither of them, and she was making a choice about that, conscious of it or not. She had tea brought. He drank it. Bonnie arrived 10 minutes later, escorted up by Diana, still holding Clover, eyes moving across the room with the comprehensive sweep of someone cataloging everything for later reporting. Bonnie looked at Giselle with the full gravity of a 6-year-old confronting a person of uncertain moral standing, and asked her directly whether she was the woman who had been unkind to her father. Giselle absorbed the question without flinching, which was a thing Elijah noticed. She did not smile with the defensive brightness adults usually employ when children ask them uncomfortable things. She looked at Bonnie steadily, brought herself to the girl's eye level with a single unhurried movement, and said, "No, but someone who works for me was, and she was sorry about that." Bonnie considered this answer for 3 seconds and then said, "Okay," and that Giselle had a very good blazer. Giselle said thank you. Elijah watched his daughter take a seat near the window with Clover, and his first instinct was not relief but something closer to gratitude, quiet, private, and not directed at any single thing. They talked for over an hour, and the conversation was nothing like the conversation Giselle had anticipated when she came downstairs. She had expected some version of leverage, a man who had been humiliated and now found himself in possession of something valuable enough to negotiate with. What she got was something far less familiar. Elijah did not bring up what had happened on the sales floor. He did not reference Carter. He did not perform injury or invite sympathy. He spoke about the vehicle she had asked about with the precise, specific language of someone who understands a machine from the inside out, not as an artifact, but as a series of solved problems. He described the decisions behind the HRS1 suspension present in the moment. When Giselle asked why he had never sold it, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said the car's name was Claire. Giselle did not ask who Claire was. She understood. She was a woman who had spent most of her professional life in rooms full of men who built things they couldn't explain their attachment to, and this was the first time she had heard one of them explain it in a single word and make her understand everything. She told him, because she did not believe in giving information less than she took it, that her presence at this location today was not a routine inspection. Meridian Auto Group was under pressure from an investment group that wanted to dissolve the regional operation and sell the licensing to an overseas conglomerate. She needed a specific kind of credibility, not financial. She had that. The balance sheets were defensible but technical and reputational, the kind that communicated to the market and to the board that this organization understood what it was selling at a level that went beyond transaction. She said there were people in the industry whose involvement, even in an advisory capacity, carried that kind of weight. People whose names changed the nature of a room. She stopped and looked at him. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're not asking me anything yet." She said, "No." He said, "Then I'm not answering anything yet." She held his gaze for a beat, longer than was strictly neutral, and something shifted in the room in a way that neither of them acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required a vocabulary neither had yet established between them. She said, "Fair enough." He said nothing. He drank his tea. Later she asked him about the work itself, not the business history, which she already knew the outline of, but the engineering. What had it felt like to design from scratch, to make decisions about load paths and geometry at the level where a fraction of a degree changed everything? He looked at her with a brief expression of reappraisal, the kind that happens when a person asks a question you were not expecting them to be capable of asking. He said it had felt like solving a sentence like there was a right answer already waiting, and your job was to work backward from it through the problem until you found the logic that produced it. She said that sounded more like mathematics than engineering. He said the line between them was thinner than most people realized. She said she had always thought the same thing about accounting. He looked at her. She said that was a joke. He said he was aware, and this small, unhurried exchange, buried in the middle of a conversation about professional leverage and vehicle specifications and the history of a company that no longer existed in the form it had taken when it was his, was the first moment that both of them, separately and without comment, registered something that was not entirely professional. His phone buzzed. He looked at it once, excused himself briefly, stepped to the window. The conversation was short, less than a minute. When he came back, his expression had changed in some small way that Giselle registered but couldn't catalog precisely. He told her that his former co-founder had called Owen Caldwell. Hollow Ridge had entered early development on a new chassis generation, a ground-up redesign of their high-performance platform, and Owen had been asking, for the past several months, whether Elijah would consider a consulting role, advisory only, no ownership, no operational commitment. Elijah had declined every time. Giselle asked what Owen had said this time. Elijah said Owen had sent him the preliminary specification sheets without asking permission, which was, he admitted, a very Owen thing to do. She asked what he had told him. He said he had told him he'd look at the documents. A pause. She said, "That's different from what you've been saying." He said, "Yes." Owen's files were still unopened on his phone when Elijah walked back downstairs to the main floor, and what happened there was neither dramatic nor uncivil, which in some ways made it more significant than if it had been. Giselle had called a 4:30 staff meeting for the full showroom team: sales, floor support, reception, management. Carter arrived without knowing the topic. He found a seat near the back, which was itself a thing people noticed. Giselle stood at the front of the room and did not introduce herself, because everyone in the room already knew who she was, which was precisely the point. She described an incident that had taken place that morning. She did not use names at first. She described the customer, the clothing, the age of the child, the nature of the inquiry, the outcome. She described what she had observed from the second floor. Then she asked the room, plainly and without editorial, "Does anyone here believe that exchange represented our organization correctly?" The room was silent. Carter shifted in his seat. He said, after a moment, that he had been making a judgment based on context and experience, that the showroom handled volume and couldn't extend premium service to every walk-in, that there were protocols for qualifying genuine interest, versus Giselle let him finish. Then she said, "The man you declined to assist this morning co-founded Hollow Ridge Automotive. The car he drove here was sold at private auction for $4.2 million. Carter's face performed a brief, involuntary sequence of expressions that ended somewhere between nausea and calculation. Giselle watched the calculation arrive and said, evenly, that the number was not the point, that the man could have arrived in any vehicle, in any clothes, with no car at all, and the obligation of this floor was the same. That the error was not in failing to recognize the value of the customer. The error was in constructing a system of recognition that depended on visible signs of value in the first place. The room was very quiet. A young woman near the front had her hands folded on her knees and was looking at the floor. Carter said he understood. Giselle said she hoped he did, and that she would be arranging a formal remediation process for the team on client qualification standards, and that Carter specifically would participate in a 3-month review cycle beginning the following Monday. If the review concluded without incident, nothing further would appear in his personnel file. If it did not conclude without incident, his employment at Meridian would end. She said this without anger, without the performance of executive severity, with the tone of someone who has thought carefully about what fairness requires and is delivering it precisely. Carter nodded. He looked once at the door. Elijah was standing in the doorway. No one had announced him. He had come back in quietly while the meeting was underway and stood at the edge of the frame in the same unhurried way he did everything. Carter saw him. Something moved across his face, not remorse exactly, but the specific discomfort of a man encountering the consequence of an action he had already decided, too late, was beneath him. He stood up, crossed the room, and said Elijah's name. Elijah looked at him. Carter said he owed him an apology, a real one, not a company one. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I appreciate that." He paused, and then, "Don't say those things in front of children." That was all. He turned away, and Carter stood there with the particular stillness of someone who has just been given exactly what they deserved and not one thing more. The paperwork for the Traverse 4.0 took 25 minutes. Giselle processed it herself, which was not something a chief executive officer of a regional automotive group typically did, and no one on the floor said anything about it, partly out of professionalism, and partly because the room still had that quality that follows a hard truth, where everyone is slightly careful with themselves. Elijah reviewed every line. He initialed without hurrying. When he reached the final page, he paused and said there was one small item he wanted to add, not to the vehicle contract, but as a written agreement between himself and the organization. He wanted Meridian to dedicate one afternoon per month at this location to a technical education session for junior staff. Not sales training, not product knowledge in the commercial sense, but engineering history, how vehicles are designed, how decisions are made at the chassis level, how the industry had evolved over the previous 70 years. He would not lead the sessions. He was not offering his own time. He was requesting that the organization create space for that kind of learning to happen. Giselle looked at him. She said, "Agreed." She did not ask why. She knew why. It was the act of a person who had been denied something he had built his whole identity around, who had watched a young man dismiss the craft he had spent his best years mastering, and who did not respond with bitterness, but with an instinct to make sure the next generation of people in this industry actually knew what they were supposed to be selling. The late afternoon had gone gold by the time Elijah walked out to the lot with Bonnie sleeping against his shoulder, one arm around his neck, Clover hanging from her loose grip. Giselle walked them out. It was not something she had planned to do. Diana watched from the entrance and said nothing. The borrowed sedan was gone. A courtesy driver had returned it to the neighbor's house earlier. The HRS one sat where it had sat all day, in the far space of the first row, unmoved and unannounced, its matte gray body holding the late light without giving any of it back. Giselle looked at it for a long moment. She said, "You called it Claire." Elijah shifted Bonnie on his shoulder. He looked at the car. He said, "Yes." She said, "Were you ever going to sell it?" He said, "No." She asked, "Why keep something that hurts to look at?" He thought about that for what felt like a longer time than it probably was. Then he said, "Because it doesn't only hurt, because she would have thought it was beautiful. Because the last conversation they had before the accident was an argument about whether the interior stitching should be charcoal or navy, and she was right, and he was wrong, and he never got to tell her." Giselle did not say anything. She looked at the car, the way you look at something you now understand you had been thinking about incorrectly, and let the silence sit without filling it. He buckled Bonnie into the back seat of the new Traverse. She did not fully wake, only murmured something about Clover, and resettled without opening her eyes and closed the door gently. He stood with his hand on the frame for a moment. Giselle was beside him. Not close, but close enough. She said, "Elijah Ward, if you ever decide to come back to this industry, not to Hollow Ridge, not to any particular company, in whatever form that decision takes, I want to be the first call you make." He looked at her, and she was looking back with the direct, careful attention she had given him all day, the same attention she had given his daughter's question, and Carter's explanation, and the clause in the service contract, the same quality of regard that did not offer more than it meant. He said, "Even if the car doesn't come with the deal." She said, "Especially then." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. He did not drive home immediately. He pulled the Traverse into the quiet end of a commuter lot 6 blocks from his house, left the engine running, and sat for a moment with the weight of the day settling around him. Then he reached into the console and opened Owen's files on his phone. He did not read them yet. He looked at the first page, a rendering of a suspension frame, all clean lines and load path notations, the geometry of a problem being solved, and felt something arrive in his chest that he had been careful, for 4 years, not to let arrive. It was not grief. Grief he knew. This was different. This was the specific discomfort of wanting something again after a long time of not allowing yourself to want anything at all. He set the phone down. He looked at the rear-view mirror. Bonnie was asleep in the back seat, with Clover tucked under her chin and one sock half off her foot, and the sight of her did what it always did, which was to put everything else in proportion without reducing any of it. He picked up the phone. He called Owen. Owen answered on the second ring and said nothing, which was unusual for Owen, who typically had words ready for every occasion. Elijah said, "The chassis spec. Send me the full document." Owen was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "How long do you need?" And Elijah said, "Tonight." Owen said he'd have it over in 10 minutes. He hung up. He sat another moment in the quiet lot. Then he started the car and drove home. In the garage, the canvas cover on Claire had not moved. He did not pull it back. Not yet. But he opened the side door, the one that faced the car, and stood in the doorway with the kitchen light behind him, and he looked at the shape of the cover in the dark, the way you look at a door you've been standing outside for a long time, not because you're afraid to go in, but because you're finally deciding that the person who is ready to go in is the same one who came out. Behind him, the house was warm and lit. Bonnie's drawings were on the refrigerator. Owen's file was downloading. He stood there for another minute, and then he went inside. In the second-floor office of Meridian's Clearwater Boulevard location, Giselle sat at the temporary desk with the quarterly report still open and still unread. Diana had gone home an hour earlier. The floor below was quiet and dark. Giselle looked at the parking lot through the glass empty now. Both lots, the visitor spaces, and the delivery row. The lights on their automatic timers, throwing pale orange across the asphalt. She thought about the car. She thought about the name Claire, and the charcoal stitching, and the argument that never got resolved. She thought about a man who had built something extraordinary, lost the most important thing in his life, and then spent 4 years not disappearing but enduring, making pancakes, taking his daughter to buy a car, accepting the small humiliations of being invisible, and then walking away from them without debt or drama. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she said especially then. She turned away from the window. She picked up her phone. She called Diana. When Diana answered, Giselle said, "I need you to pull everything there is on Hollow Ridge Automotive's current development program. Not for acquisition, not for the board." She paused. "Just because I want to understand it." Diana said, "I'll have it for you by morning." Giselle said, "Thank you." She hung up. She looked at the empty lot one last time. Then she closed the quarterly report, picked up her coat, and turned off the light.